Are you interested in a career in cybersecurity? Are you currently in law enforcement and looking to learn more about technology and cybersecurity? If so, please consider joining us for our master's degree in cybercrime and digital investigation from Michigan State University. Experience a nationally ranked program taught by world-renowned researchers like my two co-hosts on this show and practitioners that can help you play a role in combating cybercrime and advancing justice for victims. This is designed to be completed in as little as 2 years and in a flexible online format that works with your schedule. Visit cj.msu.edu to learn more. We hope you can join us. Welcome, everybody, to the Crossing the Firewall podcast. This is the podcast where we have fun, smart conversations about cybercrime and cybersecurity issues with leading experts around the world. I'm Tom Holt. I'm a professor in the School of Criminal Justice here at Michigan State University, and I'm here with my two excellent colleagues, as always.
I'm Dr. Rachel McNealey. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Criminal Justice and an associate with the center.
Hi, I'm Dr. Taylor Fisher. I'm a postdoc here at Michigan State, and I too am an associate with the center.
So we are going to talk this week about an issue that affects a ton of people worldwide. The dollar losses associated with this kind of cybercrime always amaze me. I am staggered at the severity of the problem of online fraud. And our guest today is going to be Mark Button, who's a professor at the University of Portsmouth. He is a global expert in all kinds of fraud. He's a very well-renowned economic criminologist. We're going to touch on a variety of things with him. But when we talk about fraud, one of the things that always gets me is how early fraud starts. I can't tell you how many videos we've seen in my house, because I have two younger kids, about want free Robux videos. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be the easiest entry to defrauding, sadly, kids who are like 5 and 6. Anyone with an iPad and Roblox is going to be a target for fraud. So what do you guys think about when you hear the term online fraud?
When I think of online fraud, I just kind of think of the one cybercrime that is closest to our traditional street crime, right? Fraud is very common. It's happening in different ways, different storylines, different ploys, always trying to get people, but that behavioral component is very similar across the offline and online experiences of fraud. And so that, I think, has been really my focus of how that behavior has continued, but just adapted to technology. And we just, like you said, are inundated with it. There's so many different frauds going around, different scams going around. Every website has an ad that is probably a scam of some sort. And like you said, it's getting younger and younger. And if we don't start educating people, it's going to be a real issue.
Mm-hmm. Something I'm interested in is the differences in being able to spot fraud, right? And how early that's internalized and your ability to recognize it. And I think the impact, as we've said about other forms of crime, is so varied. It's hard to nail down, this is how it's happening. You know, you got to watch your emails. You got to watch where you're putting in information, who you're communicating with. So I think it's a very complex problem, clearly, which is why we're talking about it. But I think it's our best chance for tackling the problem, because people seem to be motivated to report and take action when money is involved. And so I think that this is probably one of the areas where a lot of proactive work is being done, and is probably the area where we can best apply our existing resources, I think, because of its similarities.
Well, let's bring in our guest. Professor Button, it's excellent to have you on today. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, yes.
Excellent. Well, thanks for being with us. I know you've been studying fraud for quite a while. Can you tell us what got you into doing research on fraud to begin with?
Originally, I was a scholar interested in private policing and non-state involvement in kind of criminal justice. But as I began researching that in the kind of early noughties, it became very clear to me that when you look at fraud, you know, the vast bulk of organizations dealing with fraud are private. You know, if you're a victim of credit card fraud, you don't phone the police, you phone your bank. The banks employ far more staff than the police to investigate and deal with that kind of crime. And the more you started to dig into this subject area, you realize that, you know, the police in this type of crime are just a tiny cog. And there were so many kind of private organizations and kind of hybrid NGOs and vigilante type, you know, individuals and groups that it's just a kind of, you know, hotbed of private policing. And that just opened up a whole series of opportunities which I explored, and I've kind of grown in the area.
I think that's super interesting you bring up the vigilante, because we talk about that in context of like child predator on TikTok. People are going after child predators, right, and taking it upon themselves. But we're now seeing this boom of like people who are scamming scammers, right? Having fun or having services where they just mess with people on the phone. They're trying to scam you. And it's really interesting because it is being privately handled. I'm going to block this person once I deal with what I need, and, I'm going to deal with my banks. And so that vigilante perspective, I think, is really interesting.
Yeah, and you look at, one of the most famous scam baiters, Pierogi, a fellow American of yours, he's probably had far more impact on fraud than, some of your law enforcement agencies. And it does raise a whole series of interesting questions, doesn't it? Private individuals engaging in this type of work, should they even be involved in it? The kind of limits of the controls on them. And should the police be doing some of the things they do, and would that be acceptable? So it does raise a whole series of interesting issues, I think. Yeah.
Can you talk more about scam baiting and what that looks like?
Well, scam baiting is the kind of an individual wasting the time of a scammer. And at its most simplest, it might be just me or you. We get a call from a scammer. We know it's a scammer. So we string them along for half an hour just to waste their time, knowing we're never going to kind of give in and give any money away. Obviously, at some point, they'll probably realize that you're wasting their time and they'll hang up, probably angry. That's the most simplest form of scam baiting. But then if you go to the other extreme, the Pierogi type, scam baiters, he's probably got a team of people working with him. He obviously phones up scammers, engages with them, broadcasts that, on his YouTube channel. But also does other interesting stuff, and obviously the other famous scammer who's from Northern Ireland, Jim Browning. You look at what he does. He actually hacks the computers of the scammers, and sort of intervenes and stops victims being victims. As is Pierogi. So it's kind of like an extreme, one end to the other. You also hear a bit like the paedophile hunters of, if you like, more sinister elements to scam baiting. And certainly I've seen some stuff on some websites of which borders on racism, particularly as a lot of the scammers come from West Africa. So it's a kind of, overall I think I'm kind of positive about it, because they're actually doing something. But I think there are elements of the scam baiting community and world that are, that, shall we say, needs more control and regulation to kind of deal with some of those more negative aspects.
So in the U.S., we have the Internet Crime Complaint Center as a potential resource for reporting fraud. From a UK perspective, since you've had quite a bit of experience working in this space, what's the UK infrastructure like for victims to report fraud, and how effective would you say it is?
Well, we've gone through a kind of process which I've been kind of very close to in terms of observing over the last sort of 15, 20 years, where a bit similar to America, we have lots of police forces. Not as many as you, but we have, 43 police forces by geographical area. And we used to have a situation where each of those received reports from victims of fraud. But on top of that, there are a number of national regulators that also receive reports. And we had this problem of what I called in a report a merry-go-round. Some victims would phone up one police force, and then they get sent to another police force, or they get sent to a national regulator, and they would just be going round and round in circles. So the government created a body called Action Fraud, which is a national reporting centre, which is supposed to be where all fraud is reported in the UK. And originally that was the case. And I think the idea behind it is sound. You have someone who's a victim of fraud in my city, Portsmouth. They report. Someone from Manchester reports. The police then look for kind of common, traits and intelligence in those reports, and can hopefully then better find the fraudsters or intervene to stop, them engaging in fraud. But the challenge we've had with action fraud is, first of all, its name. Victims have confused it with a special police force, because it's called action fraud. They think, I'm phoned up action fraud and some kind of action is going to happen. But the police resources, probably like America, are still very thin, and not many frauds actually get investigated. So people have become very angry with action fraud because they phone up, report, or they report online and nothing happens. And sitting behind action fraud, we have a body called the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, which analyses all that data. And that's actually police officers. The action fraud is just basically, civilians who are appointed to kind of receive calls. And the NFIB hasn't had enough resources either. So you've got that kind of infrastructure behind, which hasn't been enough. And that's led to a lot of criticism, particularly from victims. And so it is in the process of being reformed, and we don't know the final shape of the new structure, but it will no doubt be some other form of national reporting structure, hopefully with a better name. I think if it was called a reporting centre, people would understand what it is, and not something that's going to lead to necessarily action.
Well, and it's interesting to think too, reporting is so specific in that you have to know who to report to. I can imagine if you're reporting to who you think's going to help you and you don't get action, it only delegitimizes that process, right? Now I don't want to engage in that process. If you can't help me, then I'll just deal with it on my own. And I think that question mark of who to go to is something we see across countries. Here in the US, right? I don't know if I should contact my local police, my state police, the federal government, FBI, I don't know. And that can really, hinder people to report in the beginning.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and with the preponderance of private companies being now the de facto reporting mechanisms, right? Reporting to your credit card company if you've experienced fraud. I think we are at a point where the police, in the United States at least, how we understand them as crime response, are, if not already, at risk of losing their status as de facto crime response for the most commonly experienced types of crime now by the average person. And with fraud, I think that's particularly true. But is that new? Has it always been the case that people didn't report fraud to the police, or have police historically been the response to fraud?
I think with let's say credit card fraud, I think people have always gone to their bank first of all. I think obviously the big difference between say now and 30, 40 years ago is just the scale of it. It's just so much bigger that, 20, 30 years ago, it probably wouldn't have looked so out of sync against traditional crime because it would have been a relatively small amount of crime. But now it's just much, much bigger. But I think where you've got, say, like an investment scam or a romance scam, and you've got people going to their banks, first of all, for that. And obviously in the UK, we have this new contingent reimbursement scheme where you can get your money back, even if, say, you're a kind of a romance fraud victim. I think that's where it's got very interesting, because you get the situation now where some romance victims would go straight to their bank, before the police. Now the bank might advise them, to go to the police too, but when you've got, because I think most people would regard romance fraud as more serious than credit card fraud, if you like more serious frauds, being gradually kind of, edged out of the police sphere of interest, then that does raise, I think, significant issues for the future.
Can you talk just a little bit more about that? Now, the way that I've read it, and perhaps I'm wrong, is it that they will arbitrate a victim's claim in the event that they aren't reimbursed, or how does that process work?
So this has come in through what's become known in the UK as authorised push payment fraud. So if you're deceived into kind of giving away your bank details or to making a payment to someone, previously that wasn't guaranteed you'd get compensation, because it's not like a credit card fraud where you've had absolutely no interaction, with the fraudster in most cases. A lot of banks would, on a case-by-case basis, reimburse. But as part of the government's fraud strategy, they introduced this reimbursement. I think largely with the aim of kind of pushing more responsibility onto banks to do more to prevent fraud, because obviously now they have an interest in actually preventing fraud, because it's going to cost them money. So as you would expect, there was a lot of lobbying from the banks, and originally the levels of compensation were much higher than what was actually eventually settled at. So the figure is around about £80,000 now. So what would happen is, let's say you're a romance fraud victim and you've kind of sent some money to the fraudster, and it's below £80,000. As long as you are not proved to be grossly negligent, then you would be entitled to up to £80,000 compensation. I think it's a very positive strategy, and I've noticed very much going to conferences how much more interested banks are in fraud. And preventing it, because as you can imagine, you're on the hook for a lot of money if you don't do the best to do that. And there's lots of things the banks do now which I think make a difference to kind of particularly intervening in transactions. Where I would guess in most other countries you might get odd banks that are better than others, but you're still probably, I would imagine in America, in most cases wide open. You make those kinds of payments, you lose the money.
That seems to be the way that we've heard it, is that the likelihood of compensation in a romance fraud is very, very, very low. Mm-hmm. Whereas maybe for a crypto fraud, they might be able to claw back some of those funds. But if there's a lot of direct victim to offender engagement and that transaction occurs, probably not as much.
I was going to say, I think there's more infrastructure for remediation with cryptocurrency than fiat American dollars at this point.
Yeah.
And I think innovation in the tech sector has a lot to do with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like a public safety and public health issue, especially when we're talking about interpersonal crime, that is currently hanging on the hook of private industry. And I think more so than we've ever seen it before. Mm-hmm. And right when we talk about policing and in the traditional way as criminologists, I think it's all kind of flipped on its head at this point. How do we even talk about policing cybercrime in this age?
Yeah, from your perspective, you've been doing work on different populations, particularly vulnerable populations at that. So what's your sense of the awareness of fraud from, say, that of seniors, whether it's in the UK or elsewhere? Are they aware of their risk, or how would you sort of proportionally discuss that?
I think it varies a great deal amongst older adults. I speak at a lot of kind of older adult events. Like, I get quite popular. I get sort of asked to go, and I quite like doing them. Not least because you often make contacts for future research, when you need them. But I did one a few weeks ago in Portsmouth to an event, and I talked about, fraud, and a guy came up to me afterwards, and you won't be aware of this guy in America, I don't think. Is a consumer champion in the UK called Martin Lewis, and he's very, very famous, and he's very good. He has a television program, and he gets sort of money back, money saving opportunities for people, and he's very canny, and he's almost like a saint, shall we say, in the UK. Now the scammers have been using AI to kind of and then kind of promoting it on social media and websites, etc., of investments that he's advocating. Now he never advocates any investment. and loads of people have become victims. And a guy at one of these events came up to me and said, "Oh, afterwards, I said, I've bought some investments recommended by Martin Lewis. Do you think it's okay?" So I had to tell this guy, I'm really sorry. It's probably highly likely it's a fraud because, and obviously there's been a huge amount of publicity in the UK, on the news, TV, the police, Martin Lewis himself. But obviously that hasn't got through to certain groups like these older adults. And I think older adults are particularly hard, particularly the older they get and the more isolated they are, the harder it is to get through to them with a message. You can't rely on what the police do for young people. Let's get some social media out there and raise awareness. That just doesn't work for older adults. We recently did some research on some of the very most vulnerable over 75s, largely, who are lonely, and their preferred means, this is what they actually expressed, was for loved ones and friends to give them advice. So kind of quite intensive one-to-one rather than telephone calls, which these days most telephone calls to older people are frauds, or if they're not frauds, they're certainly trying to sell them something. Or visits, kind of obviously incredibly labour intensive by the police. So yeah, I think it's certain groups, it varies very significantly how you get to them, and the most vulnerable in society, obviously a lot of them are older adults. We need to be more innovative in how we kind of get to them and get that message across. And then I think there's a whole area of victims that we just know very little about. The disabled, people with learning disabilities, people with mental health problems. I've done a lot of research on victims over the years, but I've seen very little. In fact, I can't think of any that's kind of looked at that angle of victims. And I strongly suspect that someone who's got who's disabled and isolated, even if they're young and might be active on it, is probably going to be much more open to fraud. And clearly someone with learning disabilities, and if they have access to a bank account, that's sounds a kind of very attractive proposition. Talking about very bad for a scammer, you can trick them into doing it. So I think there's a whole area of areas of victims like that we need to know a lot more about.
I think too, just as you keep talking, we've brought up so many different types of scams and different frauds. What comes to my mind when we talk about how it's adapted to cyber is how diverse these scams are and how they can be tailored to the individual very easily, right? Whether it be I'm like a phishing attempt where I'm going to go find information about this person and use it against them, or maybe I'm running an AI script that scrapes a bunch of information about a certain group of people. But when we talk about how kids are being scammed via Roblox and we talk about elderly people being targeted by romance scams, it just reinforces how different every situation is and how hard that can be to respond to, right? As law enforcement, they're not always going to have the responses that maybe are most appropriate or that the victim wants, right? They're expecting. And so I think too, when we're talking about, responses, when victims play a role in their victimization, it's treated differently, right? It's, well, you continue to give them money. I can't help that you kept doing that. It's like, well, is it fair to treat those as different instances or different types? Or can we just say scam is scam and take that victim's role out of it? I don't know, right? It's really difficult.
I mean, I think that's a parallel to when we talk about violence, right? And things like sexual assault, right? The victim's quote unquote role in it still plays a factor in how we respond to it. And I think that's interesting to see that reflected in fraud and just continue in how we think about it. Is there any particular form of fraud that you're seeing reflected among this older population who's experiencing it?
There's obviously investment type scams are kind of very common. I think impersonating loved ones. I've seen and there's some quite nasty ones. Someone phoning up the older adult. They've obviously done a bit of research, and then they say, they claim to be a police officer or something, and say your son or daughter's been in an accident. They're in trouble. They need a lawyer, and then handing them over to another scammer. And obviously I've got a 19-year-old son and a 16-year-old. The 19-year-old's at university. If I suddenly got found out by someone claimed to be a police officer, said my son, you would be in such shock, wouldn't you? Mm-hmm. So you can imagine, obviously I would, after the shock, try and check things out. But you could imagine an older adult who's, slightly starting to kind of decline cognitively. They're just going to be in shock and think, oh God, I've got to help my son or daughter. So yeah, those types of scams, just selling people stuff that they don't need. There's there's just so many. It's scary.
Mm-hmm. Something I've noticed in the IC3, so the Internet Crimes Complaint Center here in the U.S., is in their yearly reports, the number of incidents being reported by the 60-plus group has kind of hovered, gone up and down, and it's fewer instances compared to the 45 to 60 group, but the losses completely outpace them. So it's fewer incidents, but they're experiencing greater losses with those incidents. So are scammers scaling the amounts they're asking for based on the populations they're targeting, or is it just variation in the types of scams that those groups are being suspected to?
I think most scammers kind of, once they start talking to a victim, they ask them questions to make an assessment of how much money they've got. And obviously, once they've got that assessment, they will try and empty their bank accounts. Particularly with some of these impersonation scams where they, claim to be from the bank or some other, and they get access to their computer, then get them to open up their bank accounts. They'll see how much they've got. And sadly, a lot of older adults have obviously built up savings over their lives and have pension lump sums, etc. They're kind of prime targets. Whereas, if they got my son, at university, he hasn't got much money, so they might be able to get into his overdraft, but they wouldn't get much out of him.
Right. Yeah. So they're losing more money because they have more money there to lose. Then essentially. Yeah.
I think the common theme that keeps popping up through all scams is that urgency, right? That need to act right now. If I can convince you that if you act right now, then there's a much lower chance of you thinking through this and, checking out who I am and verifying the process. And so, as we talk about the diversity of it, I feel like that common thread of, no, you need to act now. You're going to miss out on this opportunity. Or, somebody's hurt and needs you right now. So-and-so's in jail. You need, bail them out. It's that urgency that gets people to act. And I can only imagine with older adults, that urgency is tenfold.
I was just going to ask, since you've been doing a lot of research in different countries as well around fraud victims, like I know you've been doing some work in South Korea in addition to the UK. Is there a substantive difference, kind of on the topic we've been hitting on here, is there a substantive difference in either the concept of the fraud itself or the response to fraud? Does it seem as though most nations are coming at this problem from the same perspective of compensation after the fact, or is there more proactive responses in certain places? What's your perspective?
I think in Korea, they have some very positive things. They have a lot of police dedicated to fraud, but it's very much after the event. And because of the global nature of fraud, it's sadly, pretty useless, because they soon discover that the fraudster's based in China or North Korea or Thailand or somewhere like that, and there's not much they can actually do about it. So they don't do as much, in my view, in terms of prevention in Korea, certainly compared to us and probably compared to America. So I think there's more scope for them to kind of operate there. I think there's also much more of a reliance on technology in Korea. They're kind of very focused on their kind of phones and apps, and there's kind of, I think there's a mindset that we can just create some app that will kind of stop this. That's the kind of the solution. But the impacts and the scale probably fairly similar to many other countries. But I think probably Korea, not just Korea, maybe Japan as well. There's also, I think, there's a lot more shame attached with being a victim, and so you get, I think, a lot more suicides of victims. That you obviously get that everywhere, but I think particularly in places like Korea, that's another problem. So yeah, I think it's a global problem. I mean, you're probably aware of the recent report by the Social Market Foundation, which kind of compared 15 countries and fraud victimization rates, and top of the table, and not position you want to be, was actually your country, America. But most countries had very high victimization rates, and those were countries in there covering Brazil, Japan, the UK, America, etc. And so it's a global problem everywhere.
So when you talk about the response, and particularly Korea being more technical, how do you see other countries, or just kind of globally, that balance of like the human approaches versus the technical approaches? Is there a better way to prevent this? Is it better to just educate the population to be aware of this? Or is it better to develop tech to protect those people? I'm sure it's somewhere in the middle, but I wonder what your perspective is.
I think it's the problem is fraud is so diverse. There's no kind of simple solution. It's like there are solutions for particular types of fraud, and you kind of have to kind of build upon those. I think one of the problems that we face is, if you were to compare this to kind of traditional crime, there's a whole body of research, call it crime science, evidence-based policing, all of that, where you can say, well, if you've got this problem of disorder, there are these studies that show, patrolling police officers has this impact, or burglaries. If you do these types of things, you put these kinds of devices on, on houses, it kind of reduces this amount of, and it's like pretty good research, based to kind of prove that. I think with fraud, we're kind of still pretty much in the dark ages, there's so many different types of fraud and so many, potential ways to dealing with it, but a very limited evidence base on whether it actually works. And that, I think, is a key thing that governments need to kind of think about in funding more research to see what works. The amount of times I get contacted by the UK government and they want to know solutions, and I can give them ideas, but I can never say, well, this will work, because we haven't got that evidence base. And sadly, governments just don't seem to want to kind of get their checkbooks out. But I think ultimately, and I pity you guys at the moment, whether Trump would get his checkbook out to kind of fund this kind of research, I don't know. I know he has lots of kind of interest in different types of crimes, particularly immigration related stuff as well. But maybe one day, he'll get his focus on fraud, and then suddenly the funds will flow in America. But I think we've still got a gap in this country and many other countries on those kind of evidence-based research.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's so hard to get people, or I say people, researchers into cyber, because as we've talked about, there's that barrier of, well, I don't get tech, I don't work with computers, I don't know how to deal with cyber fraud. But really, it's just fraud in different communication platforms. And so getting people to get that evidence is hard enough, let alone convince the government that it's worth using. So,
yeah. And I think it's a perennial issue of being an academic, right? Is getting the resources and the floor to do research that is agnostic of private industry and brands, right? And traditional like crime science research with policing at least, right, was you could approach a single agency that had a jurisdiction and you could do kind of a isolated, like randomized control trial. We have a history of those. And that equivalent just doesn't exist for the internet, right? There's not a corner of the internet you could go test something out in and say, hey, we're going to randomly assign people to treatment, but it's for the whole internet. Like, the equivalent is hard, I think.
It's hard, but not impossible. I think there's, you could build experiments, particularly for certain types of frauds, certain types of initiatives. Just give you, call blockers. The practical base of them, you would think they must work. And I strongly suspect that certain call blockers do work and do reduce victimization. But do we have a kind of randomized control experiment which shows call blockers work? We don't.
Mm-hmm.
So from your perspective, what is industry doing in the absence of that coordinated whole of government, whole of law enforcement response? Is there any company that's doing it better than others? What's your take on the role of industry in fraud regulation?
Yeah, that's a kind of interesting, and that's a hard question to answer. I think when you go to kind of conferences, and particularly when you see some of the big tech put up, slideshows of initiatives to detect fraudulent websites and posts, whatever, it always looks, really positive. But lo and behold, you go onto your Facebook, you still find loads of adverts which are clearly selling fraudulent things. So the reality is, well, I'm sure they're stopping a lot of stuff, but are they really working? I think it's the best people to talk to at the moment about that are people like the UK banks, because they've had this kind of financial pressure, put over them with the contingent reimbursement. I think, they, from what I understand, are spending lots of money on different products, and not to kind of, a randomized control experiment level. They will have good ideas of what's working and what isn't in terms of, their customers. And in fact, I've had conversations with banks, and they say, they know certain stuff works and certain stuff doesn't, but they won't publish it, so, which is always they keep a lot of their research internally, as do the big tech companies. You talk to Google or Meta, and you say to them, well, you should be doing research on this guy. And they go, well, we are. We've got loads of data. Well, publish it. No, they won't. Give me the data, I'll publish it.
Yeah.
So I think that I think is, we started off with private policing, and I think that is one of the downsides of private, the work, because this world is dominated by the private sector. It's much easier when you're dealing with burglary and robbery and all those types of things, because it's dominated by state organisations, and that the research is always published and always out there. But once you get private organisations involved, they want to sit on their data. It's like a competitive advantage, and they fund it for their own uses, not for a kind of public benefit. And so that's hard. I probably you at the same time, I've had companies come to me and say, we want to kind of evaluate this thing, and but we don't want to publish it. And then you have to make a choice then. Well, do I do this work, just for the benefit of the university to make a load of money, or do I find something else to do? Because if you're not going to be able to publish it, that's a kind of a limitation. So I think that is a kind of one of the fundamental challenges which comes out of a kind of a crime problem dominated by a much more mixed sector, which involves many more private organisations.
Do you think as that private sector response continues to grow and continues to kind of be the main response, we'll see better partnerships between researchers and companies?
I think, Yes, is the answer, because I think ultimately, such is the nature of fraud. I mean, it's an arms race that the fraudsters, get better at what they're doing as companies protect themselves, and companies ultimately need to kind of tap into the best knowledge out there on dealing with fraud. And there's still a great deal of talent out there in universities across the world, researching this problem, that have something to offer those companies. So I think in the long run, and particularly as more students come in and do PhDs in this area and have obviously something to say, companies will turn to these people. They will have to.
So what, from your perspective, is the biggest risk coming down the pipe? Is it AI? Is it a different kind of technology? What do you see as the biggest risk when it comes to fraud on the whole?
Yeah, well, I think it's got to be AI, because it just kind of wipes out so many controls that people and organizations have to protect themselves. From the very start, the basic thing, and I still see this today, people give advice, look at the grammar of a message. Well, that's useless advice now. Any scammer with half an ounce of nous goes on to, ChatGPT or something equivalent and rewrites their emails, or their website. So, that at the kind of base level. But then you've got the images, the ability to kind of replicate audio and video and impersonate people's voices. I was talking to a police officer not long ago, and she was dealing with a case, again, of an older adult who thought she was talking to her daughter. They'd actually gone to the effort of getting some, audio footage of the daughter, and then using that to kind of then talk to the mother. Now imagine that, my son phoned me up now, and it's just sounded like my son, and he said, "Dad, can you send me, £100?" Now obviously I have his bank account. I immediately know if he said, "Send it to this account instead," I think, well, there's something not quite right here. But, it's like, that kind of basic thing is, really, really scary. And then you kind of look at the really scary potential implications of AI. On the one side, you go to a security conference, a fraud conference, and you get all these companies and say, we've got all this big data and AI now, we can identify if a transaction is a fraud or not. But turn that on its head for the fraudsters, and use AI to find me people who will be vulnerable to this type of scam. So, there we have at the moment, all over the world, scammers phoning people up, sending emails to people, and probably, with very low hit rates, 1 in 100, 1 in 200, whatever. Suddenly they're down to, maybe 1 in 5, 1 in 10. So I think AI has got to be kind of the top scariest thing when it comes to kind of the risk of fraud down the line.
I think too with AI, when we're talking about the regulation side of things, right, ChatGPT supposedly doesn't allow you to work on criminal things, but we asked it to make a pig butchering scam and it did it immediately. So, that question of how do we trust these third-party vendors that are providing these tools to the average human to regulate it in a way that says that is illegal, that is a scam, that can harm people, and therefore we are not going to engage in that behavior. Do we have the right to tell them to do that? Are they ever going to listen? I don't know. But, it seems that they play a very important role in managing how that tool is used, because sometimes it didn't give it to us. Sometimes it said, no, this is illegal, that's not allowed. And then, of course, in front of the cops, it did it. So it's wild to me how the regulation behind these tools is so far behind that I don't know if it'll ever catch up.
Yeah, there's just so many areas, and just something as simple as a Google search, the number of searches you do and the top, 1 or 2 items are scams. How can that still be the case, with all the kind of tools that they have? So yeah, I think, and it's obviously an incredibly difficult question to address. How do we regulate all these technical initiatives to kind of protect ourselves? But ultimately, we're going to have to do it if we, if we want to kind of protect people from fraud.
Yeah, the phrase "move fast and break things" has just been rattling around in my head as the tech ethos, especially with the preponderance of that in our government right now in the United States. But when we're talking about breaking things, we're breaking down trust, we're breaking down social norms and how people interact with the modes that facilitate social interaction. So I understand not wanting to stifle innovation, and I think that's important. But I don't know that people have fully wrapped their heads around how the proliferation of this has put real ways to do real harm into people's hands who will use it to fulfill their most base needs, urges, right? And make illegal activity easier. People think of, AI taking over the world. Okay, sure, maybe. But right now, we have people using AI to do really bad things. And I don't think people have that running parallel with the future innovation when they think and talk about it.
Or the use of AI to produce that victim impact statement in court in
Oh my
Arizona. I don't know if you saw this, but an AI tool was used to generate a video presentation of the victim in a road rage incident who was killed to speak on their own behalf as a victim impact statement in court.
Wow.
To the offender. It's one of the most unusual things I've ever seen, and I understand that can be extremely powerful, but it does beg the question: is that the best use of the tool? What are the legal implications of that? If you can make a pseudo-realistic video of a victim, how could that be applied in all kinds of other criminal contexts, particularly fraud? It's very challenging.
Wow. I've never heard of that before. That is amazing. Yeah, that raised all kinds of questions.
Yeah. I think that article just came out this week. I think I sent it to you.
Yes, you did. I was trying not to date us, but
yeah, it's wild though.
I think too, though, like to the parallel conversation, think about how that could help, like children having to give testimony, or I think like there are great uses, and to that point, you don't want to stifle innovation, and so how can we go about? I mean, me personally, if they did that to me in court, I'd be going for a mistrial. I'd say this is ridiculous, absolutely not. I don't know where you got this evidence, quote unquote, from. But to think that there are other ways that technology can be used for beneficial reasons, is it worth it to say no AI testimony in court? I don't know.
So we've talked a lot about various kinds of research, of policy, of practice. From a broader level, just thinking about kind of academic research, I know you started the International Society for Economic Criminology. Can you tell us a little bit about what that will do and how this kind of fits into the broader landscape of fraud and other kinds of cybercrime?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that we've been frustrated with over the years is we're obviously criminologists, and we go to the British Criminology Conference and the European Society Criminology Conference, and we felt, particularly in the British context, that there wasn't a kind of strong interest in what we're kind of researching. We'd go to these events and there would be just like a handful of people that would come to our sessions. Now, the European Society is much better. You get a reasonable response, but obviously that's Europe, and it's split when you look at it in terms of kind of economic crime in its broader sense. You've got cybercrime and you've got sort of corporate crime, and you've got this split. So we thought there's a gap in the kind of market for something much more specialized and focused upon economic crime in its kind of broader sense. So not just fraud, but economic cybercrime, but espionage, money laundering, corruption, etc., which all of these things are often linked. We thought there was a gap in the market. And the other thing that we really wanted to do, and I think both the British and the European, and I haven't been to the American one for some time, so I can't speak for the American one, but I would suspect it's probably the same, is that we don't get enough practitioners at these conferences. And the one thing that we've learned from running our centre conference every year is we get a majority of practitioners. They're hungry and interested to learn more about the research that's going in this area. So we wanted to kind of create a society that embraced practitioners much more, to not only encourage them to kind of use our research, but also to engage in research and commission research. So those were the reasons behind it. We've kind of put together a team of people. We've set it up as a kind of charity. So it's a formal legal entity now. We have a website, and I can share that afterwards. We plan a lot of things. So we've got our first conference, which will be a relatively small event, just before our centre conference. But we hope next year that it will be a much bigger event, probably on the scale of the British Society of Criminology conference, bringing together practitioners and academics. We plan a whole series of other things for the society to do. We want to create a hub of all the kind of key resources and research on different aspects of economic criminology that members and perhaps even non-members can have access to. So if you want to find out, what works in preventing fraud, you kind of go to this website, you can find all of that research there ready. And the other thing, we had a board meeting actually last Friday, and what we've decided to do is we're going to set up some awards. Now, most societies have awards, but they're kind of very narrow. They might have the best book and the best paper, and we want to have a whole suite of awards. And I would imagine it's the same in America. There's a real culture of awards in the UK at the moment. For practitioners, we have the biggest awards, the Tackling and Economic Crime Awards. That's really big, glamorous event. Not quite the Oscars, but from an academic's point of view, going to the TICAs, it's quite something special. So we want to create something not quite as glamorous as that, because that will cost a lot of money, but for economic crime. To further excellence. It'll be global, and we'd encourage people to kind of submit. We're going to create a system for kind of approving those awards, and we think that will further excellence again more in the research and ultimately the fight against all these different economic crimes. So those are some of the things we're doing. Many other things, many other ideas, and we're obviously going to discuss those at the first conference in June.
That's great. And I always wonder when we talk about academic research, it's great that we talk to one another. It's great that we write these papers. But realistically, how much do you think the average corporate entity is looking to a long form academic paper? Like, how can societies like this perhaps break down some of those barriers that we've artificially, to some degree, put into place?
Well, I think, if you've got a society that has at its core members who are practitioners, not just academics, you kind of make the kind of dissemination of research central to that society, I think you will achieve that aim. Obviously, you're never, we've all probably come across police officers who we know who are never going to be interested in reading any kind of research articles. You're not going to convert everyone, but there's a lot of professionals out there that are interested, and that's one of the things from our centre conferences that I've learned. We have these practitioners turning up and they're hungry for research. They want access to papers, and I think one of the great benefits of increasing the kind of amount of publications that are open access, that also helps. So I think there's a hungry knowledge out there to learn more in public and private sector bodies. So the society will just add to that basis of disseminating that knowledge out to them.
Yeah, we'll absolutely get that dropped into the show notes if you can share it with us. That would be great to help promote it a little bit more. Do you want to ask our...
Sure. So to wrap up, we usually ask our guests the big question, to distill all of this into a single piece of information that you think the average person should know about the landscape of fraud or how we're tackling it right now.
Wow, a single piece of information. Oh dear, you really got me there.
It is a big question.
Right at the end.
I mean, it's just really difficult to distill it into one single piece of information. I have so many sources of information come into me myself. What if I wanted to keep on track with the very, very latest scams that are emerging? I would probably sign up to some of the key scam baiters, because A, it's entertaining, and B, they tend to be much more advanced than the police in kind of uncovering these types of things. But that can be quite lengthy, and obviously, so if there's an older adult watching this who's not interested in that kind of thing, that's probably more difficult. It's probably a case then of finding a reputable organisation that kind of gives out alerts and information, and sort of extracting that information. And obviously when our society is up and running, well, we'll be disseminating lots of information, so that will probably solve it all then.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, this was great. Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate all of your insights and all your experience. This was really, really helpful. I'm sure all of our listeners appreciate it too. We'd love to have you back on and talk more about this, because we arguably just kind of scratched the surface of all the different issues in fraud and all the different areas you work in. Just for those listening, I imagine we don't have a ton of UK listeners, but in the event that we do, there's going to be the conference for the Center for Cybercrime and Economic Crimes conference at the University of Portsmouth in June, so that's a great event if you can attend. As you mentioned about the center as well, we'll make sure to get that dropped in. So thank you so much for joining us, and we appreciate all of your effort. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe, leave us a review, smash that like button so that way you can keep following us for all the good stuff that we're up to. And I hope you can join us the next time we cross the firewall. Thanks for listening to the Crossing the Firewall podcast. This is a production of the Center for Cybercrime Investigation and Training in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University, produced by J.J. Thomas. The thoughts and opinions expressed are those of the hosts and the guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the university. If you have a comment or a question about the show, please email us at crossingthefirewall@gmail.com. Also, make sure that you follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn for more information. And if you're enjoying us on your favorite podcast app, please make sure that you like the show and leave us a review so that way everybody knows what we're up to. And if you're listening in on YouTube, make sure that you like us and subscribe so that way you're staying up to date on everything that is crossing the firewall.